All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third year of our FAIR Dialogues series, which is a part of the FAIR project, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. In case you haven't seen the past two seasons, they're up on the 8-1 YouTube channel, where you'll find wonderful conversations with people from all walks of lives, all parts of the world, including a wonderful conversation we had with Caroline Casey, who is the founder of the Valuable 500 and doing wonderful work for people with disabilities. Rosalia Arteaga, who was the first woman president of Ecuador. Sonia, Randhawa, who's leading citizen assemblies in Australia and spreading them to across the world, and many, many more, including what is actually my favorite is the conversation we had with the wonderful Kamlaji, with Kamla Basin. It's a conversation that I keep going back to every now and then because of the value that we derived from it. And I'm sure if you watch hers and everyone else's videos that are up on our YouTube channel, you will have the same kind of experience that we have every time we have these conversations and go back and listen to them again, right? For those of you who are new here, the FAIR Dialogues is a series of conversations we have with guests who are absolutely wonderful people doing wonderful things in their different spheres. And the idea behind these conversations is not to get you to agree or adopt any of the ideas that you hear on these dialogues, but to really to get you to challenge some of these ideas, to get you to try and find direction to your own thoughts, and then finally, eventually, hopefully, as it is with the FAIR project, develop thoughts of your own and to determine whether you want to take ownership over a particular line of thought and make it absolutely your own, unique to yourself, right? I'm delighted to start this year's FAIR Dialogues with a dear friend who's been with us for a couple of years now at the FAIR project. She was a mentor to one of our change makers last year, and this year she's been gracious enough to come and speak with all of you over here. Susan Ferguson, who is the country representative for India at UN Women. She's been in the UN system since 2017, but prior to that, she's had decades of experience working with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, with AusAid, pretty much all over the world. Now, from Papua New Guinea to South Africa to Solomon Islands, and now, of course, here in India, she's got a depth of experience with all of these. So, welcome, Susan. Welcome to the FAIR Dialogues, and it's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Ramit. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So let's just get started. And I know everyone's eager to the conversation that you and I are about to have right now. And I want to start off by asking you the question that I've had on my mind, and which I believe is going to be great for the young audience that we've got right now, is what actually got you started in working with respect to gender and gender equality and women and all of that. And because, and I do know that you did your bachelor's in social work way back in the 80s, you stuck around. You've actually tried to see things through and be here all these years, right? So what brought you into these areas and what's kept you here?
Thank you, Ramit. And you ask such thought-provoking questions. You know, as you pointed out, it's quite a few decades ago, so I'm now racking my brains. But for me, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and as you know, that was really a massive sort of impetus for the women's movement and also human rights in general. So when I entered social work, I discovered early on I was not interested in the individual casework side of things because I didn't feel that really changed things for example, poor people. You know, there needed to be structural and social changes for a lot of the people that I had been helping through casework who were essentially poor, and that was actually causing the problems that they had rather than individual things. So that got me interested in community development, which was at that time was a very political way of working, mobilizing communities to advocate for their rights and change some of the structural inequalities. And I found that fascinating and incredibly powerful. You know, we did such things as setting up housing co-ops with homeless people and childcare cooperatives and, you know, a whole range of things we were also able to advocate and change some of the laws that kept people where they were. And so from that, I had always wanted to travel and to work overseas, where as a personal thing, but also because I knew that I would learn a lot and be able to contribute there as well. So after a career in Australia where I worked with Indigenous people, for example, who remain very disadvantaged in Australia. In fact, it's a bit like a third world within the first world. I then moved into international development work, and I've always had a focus on social justice. And so within that, of course, there's so many different slices you can make within social justice. And in the feminist field, we call that the intersectionality. So, looking at class, and in India, of course, caste, ethnicity, religion, and importantly, gender. So gender equality has always been one of the fundamental inequalities. And of course, because I myself am a woman and I've experienced gender inequality throughout my whole life, so I'm very, very motivated still to try and see what we can do to support gender equality. So it's from both a personal place, an experiential place, and also a political space that I remain interested in gender equality. I hope that answers your question in a nutshell, Ramit.
Thanks, Susan. It's something that at least I've always maintained, right? Which is the reason why, even as part of our foundation, gender equality is one of our goals. And, it was a massive debate that we had, that do we keep equality as our goal or gender equality as our goal, right? And we all landed at fairly unanimously that we have to keep gender equality as our goal, because at the end of the day, and you see this in all parts of our world, right? Not every place that we are in world will have discrimination based on, say, caste. It's not everywhere in the world.
No.
We may not have discrimination based on economic power everywhere. We may not have discrimination on the basis of race everywhere, but discrimination on the basis of gender is pretty much in every single corner of our world, right? Even some of the most advanced nations and so on and so forth. And what we figured out was that if we can try and find a way to try and have conversations, do work on the grassroots with respect to gender equality, then the lessons we learn from there can be applied absolutely everywhere in all other types of discrimination as well. And this is really the one thing that unifies the whole world, really. And it's so sad to say this in this manner, but it really unifies the whole world in its commonality across the world, right?
Yes.
It's surprising. Sorry, but I just had to say that when you spoke about. Right.
And actually, I'm so glad that you thought that, because my experience working in the different sort of social justice areas is that unless you have a specific focus on gender equality within your work, inevitably the focus on women and people of diverse genders disappears. It's, it's a fact, because even within the sort of human rights area, gender equality is often seen as a lower thing to work on. So you have to have a specific focus on it in order to maintain a focus on it.
No, absolutely, and you have to put it front and center, right? And that's how I like to see it. And similarly, like when you spoke about the Indigenous people in Australia, and I was at the University of Sydney delivering a lecture about a few years ago, and every single time there's a function that starts at the University of Sydney. First, it starts with a vote of thanks to the Indigenous people, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how effective that is, but at least the one thing that I do know that it does is it again puts them front and center. So even for people like me coming from different countries, even I'm sure all the students who are there at the University of Sydney and other places in Australia, and this happens across borders, as I understand, at the very least, they're not being made invisible. At the very least, they're being put front and center, so that if there are individuals who want to try and see if there are things that they can do or change the way that they think and so on and so forth, it's right in front of you. And then that just allows for that change to happen. I think that's right. Needed for gender equality as well, right? We need to put gender equality front and center for conversations to happen and for people not to make it invisible as it keeps happening all over the world, right?
Yeah.
But tell me a bit more about India. Tell me a bit more about your time here in India, about what you've got started here, with your experience from across the world as well. Do you see differences in the way that think conversations around gender equality are here in India, good, bad, or ugly, whatever it may be, right? And from all fronts, right? Feel free, Susan, whether it's with respect to actual gender inequality, the people who are working for gender equality, do we understand what we're doing, or is there a long way to go? And anything that you'd like to share?
Okay, well, again, that's a very, quite a deep sort of a question, really, because there is such such a massive spectrum of work and thought and policies around gender equality in India. And I've only been working in India now for a year and a half, and the pandemic stopped me coming when I first got the job. I had to work from Australia for a while, and then when I came, it was just before the second wave of the pandemic. So I spent like 5 months by myself in my house. So it took, I feel like I'm kind of behind because of the pandemic. But that said, I've found India to be, as you would, of course, know, it's such a diverse place and such a diverse experience. So, and the indicators, therefore, are sort of all over the place in a way. There's excellent work happening in India, and actually drawing on my own, my own studies many years ago, a lot of the feminists, the global feminists with status because of their substantive research, come from India. So India has always been a thought leader on gender equality, and India itself took a really keen interest in the development of their sustainable development goals also. And so India remains, committed to gender equality in a way that a number of countries around the world are not. So I think that's the first starting point, and that's also why I'm so sort of hopeful, and also why I love the work we do in UN Women and the work that I see happening on gender equality, because there is so much potential in India. And also, I think here you have the, economies of scale, in a sense, that small things can make a huge difference to many, many people, because there is the depth of, for example, economic growth, and there's the interest in, a green economy, and there's so much of what the world is struggling to do. India is a petri dish for so much of that, and so much innovation has also occurred in India, especially around the digital side of things. And here, if I look at, for instance, my own country in Australia, I went back at Christmas time and was like, oh my God, where are we back in the 20 years ago, before the digital revolution? Because I'm used to, in India, I can get anything on Amazon, and I can even get an X-ray machine to my house. So that's what I mean about the sort of enabling environment in India is set for a big leap forward, I think. That said, of course, because there's such a massive population and such diversity within the population, there are pockets of inequality that remain, and that will continue to need very specific help and support, to be able to overcome the kind of levels of discrimination that people experience. And often it's women at the bottom of those different intersecting areas of disadvantage. So, so I think there's still, of course, more work to be done, more challenges, but also there is an enabling environment, I think, that can be really leveraged to bring about further change for women in India. And actually, I have to say, every day I'm seeing new things and learning new things, about what is occurring in the country and what can be, taken to scale or is being taken to scale. So, yes.
Yeah, that's very useful, Susan. I'll tell you, I think, and you're absolutely right about the diversity of India. I think speaking about India in a generalized manner is next to impossible. And I know the kind of spot that I put you in when I asked you the question as soon as I asked it, right? But What also happens in India, and at least we've noticed it many a times, and I want to ask your view on how you see this, because especially since you worked in places like the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea as well, where a lot of the times what ends up happening is that those people who are trying to make change are not from the communities where they're trying to make the change happen, right? And invariably, at least in India, we've noticed that a lot of times people with the intentions try and make that change, but recognize after, say, a year or 2 years that the community actually doesn't want that change, right? And we've ended up deciding for those communities what's right, or what's the particular way that they need to move forward, and so on and so forth. And then it's already too late by the time we realize that the community perhaps wanted it in a different manner, right? Now I know at UN Women and at a lot of the other departments at UN, there's a lot of focus on the community, right? Unlike some other initiatives that end up happening, and it does happen all over the world, right, in spite of best intentions. So is that, in your mind, like, how do you really create that balance between understanding the community and their needs versus what is identified by us, by others like us, about what's actually needed for society, for a community, and so on and so forth, right? So is there a balance to be maintained between that, and how do you have any thoughts on how that balance can actually be maintained?
Yes, well, that takes me back to my community development, education and beginnings. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, where you said there needs to be a balance, because often communities remain disadvantaged because they don't have the resources to bring about change. They may not have the education, they may not have the health, they may not have the connections with different people within power, for example. So I think it needs to be a blend of people who can bring some of that. Again, it's a little microcosm of the enabling environment to community level, and then I think it is about working with communities to design the programs that will affect them. And I know that, I've been involved at the moment with some of the zonal meetings that the Ministry for Women are having around the country. And they're very much about what is being called convergence at the local level. There's a lot of really excellent government initiatives, but often it's hard to bring them down to that local level. And there's a recognition, I think, that everyone needs to be involved there. And that includes civil society and, women at district level, male power brokers at district level, and below to block level also. So, of course, it is a balance, because there are broader issues as well, like, for example, universal basic education, which India has done very well in meeting that SDG. And that is an essential element for communities to be able to access education. So some of these things are widespread and don't necessarily need a community push. They're rather a service that can reach community and does reach community in many ways. But then there are these other areas. For example, we do work with the government around gender responsive budgeting, and that entails being able to listen to what the community is saying they need to be able to plan for government resources to meet those needs. And that can be happening at the panchayat level, the state level, and the national level. So again, that's a kind of a national program, but it does have the potential to reach the community and for the community to have a say. So it's about being both opportunistic, I think, and seeing what are the levers around in the broader environment that can be brought to bear at community level, and what is the energy within the community to drive some of those benefits and for themselves.
Yeah, I think spot on. I think just at the end what you said is for themselves, right? And I think that really for me is my key takeaway, because at the end of the day, everything that can be provided, everything that assistance that can be given, it's as we said very rightly, like these are basic things that we can send across, we can help give and provide and give access to, and so on and so forth. But what they make of it needs to be for themselves, right? And that's where then you allow individuality to then to prosper, and then determine what it wants for itself, whether it's as a community or an individual or a household, however it may be, right? So wonderful. Let's take a bit of a detour now from this particular conversation, and more about India, really. And I'm sure it's valid to a large part of the world as well, and you can validate that for me from your experiences. And this is a question that we've got on chat from Isha here as well. And I'm going to paraphrase it a bit and add a bit more context. But at least I've always noticed while I was growing up as well, that whenever times get tough in Indian households, at least, it's the women that step up, right? Now, whether it's be in rural India, and I spent about 10 odd years in rural India working with farmers, it would be the women who are doing the toughest jobs, right? Whether it's getting water for the house, whether it's sowing the lands, and so on and so forth. Everything that required effort and was difficult was being done by the women, right? Even in our urban houses, whenever there's trouble, right? Whenever there's a problem, invariably, at least I can't generalize, but invariably you'd see our aunts and our sisters and our mothers taking that load, right, off the household. But inevitably, when things get better, when there is upward mobility with respect to just the economic strata, when things become easier in the household and troubles aren't there, that's really when, at least I've noticed, that women start getting subjugated and subdued. That's when the men, that discrimination begins there to a large part, where suddenly, because things are okay, apparently it's the men's time to well, rule the roost, if you may, right? And I'm deliberately being a bit provocative with respect to this, right? But again, and then again, you see another cycle where there again there's trouble and there's a concern and an issue, and again we go back to our women. And then you again see them in the villages and everywhere else. They're the ones who are fighting the droughts. They're the ones who are helping out in the floods and so on and so forth, right? And this cycle, and I've briefly noticed it in the developed world as well, if you may, right? Do you really see that across the world, or is it an Indian phenomena? And irrespective of whether it's an Indian phenomena or a global phenomena, do you have any thoughts of how we can really break out of it? And I know it's a very difficult question, so even your thoughts around this would be useful, in my opinion, so that we can all find our ways to try and break out of this in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think that's a global phenomenon. I don't think that's an Indian specific phenomenon. And I think it's not all of a sudden that women are subjugated. I think they were subjugated beforehand. And then the crisis happened and women took more responsibility, and then they were again subjugated when that crisis was averted. So I think it's a continuum. And actually, if we look at history, as you were talking, I was thinking about, well, writ large, that happened during the Second World War, where so many men went off to war, and women had to then staff the factories and move from the domestic sphere into the public sphere. And they ran these industries that were completely male dominated beforehand perfectly, and then so I think women themselves thought, fantastic, when men come back, things will be changed. When men came back, they were kicked out of these positions, moved back into the domestic sphere, and men took back those positions. So, but it actually gave women the experience and the knowledge and the confidence that they can do these things. And I think that was the basis actually for the feminist movement to move forward in the sort of late 50s, early 60s and 70s. I think it gave a longer term push for women to take their place in the public sphere as well. And I hope that's the case at village level as well. Maybe that will allow women to have a broader view of their lives and what they're capable of and their status and position within themselves. So, I mean, that's not good enough. It's not good enough to have to kind of wait for women to discover that themselves and then fight the battle to be able to move back into those spaces. But unfortunately, that does seem to be often what happens, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's any easy answer to the question. But again, I look at South Africa. When I worked there, it was post-apartheid, and similarly, women had been part of the anti-apartheid movement, and then but because of that, they were then at the table in drawing up um, some of the changes to South Africa going forward. The new constitution, which was an incredible constitution. Actually, I mean, having seen India's constitution, it also is incredible. So I think those movements do forge social change, which bubbles up in different ways over time. I think it doesn't mean the struggle's over, but it gives a footing to continue to move ahead, because this never changes overnight, unfortunately. And then, of course, to bring about further change, it is about making sure that women can continue to access post-pandemic, skills development, safety from domestic violence. These kinds of social services remain incredibly important to allow women to be able to move beyond the domestic sphere.
No, absolutely. Just the first part when you were talking about crises, right? And I was listening, and I was asking myself, and unfortunately, it just strikes such a chord, saying that yes, in a way that you do need crisis for change to happen, right? And you've seen that even not just with respect to gender equality. If you look at pretty much most of the revolutions that our world has gone through, it's been due to a crisis, right? And then it's because of that crisis, certain things have come up. There's whether it's upward mobility from an economic standpoint, whether it's from the caste system, whatever it may be, right? I think crisis is actually what has led to the kind of change that we all see today. And of course, I would be the last person to say that we've seen the kind of change that we need to, because there's so much more to do in all of these spheres, in these areas. But it just sounds such a it sounds so manipulative in a way to say that, look, that there needs to be crisis for change to happen, because you'd hope that all of us can actually make change for positive reasons, and not for negative reasons, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that we just see so often, that not just with crisis, but inevitably something bad needs to happen for people to wake up, right? um, and that's where, like, do you think, have you seen any examples of positive movements, of positive initiatives, where you're only talking about the happy things, where people are smiling, and yet we're able to make the kind of societal change that, of course, we're striving for, we're looking to make, and so on and so forth? Like, do you have any examples of people actually smiling and yet change happening?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think again, this is where there is. I mean, as I get older, there's so many shades of grey, and it's not just black and white. It's not just either or, a crisis and then change. There can be, many impetus for changes. I think that syntax is wrong there, but you know what I mean. And actually, if I look at my own country, it's had sort of 200 years, I mean, post-colonial, sadly, and the impact on Indigenous people, which was devastating. But over the 200 years of the colonial sort of settlement, um, gradually Australia has moved from being a very poor nation to a wealthy nation, and there's been many incremental changes over that time, including, the right for women to vote. And Australia was the second country, actually, after New Zealand, to allow women to vote in national elections. So, and that happened around the turn of last century. So that has led to, women having a voice over time and being able to gradually advocate and change. But, it's not fast. But it does occur in fits and bursts. And I think you can see that in India. Even with the pandemic, you can see in India that there are changes, and there are things already in place that women can make use of, which don't involve crisis. Their access to a range of different social protection mechanisms, skilling endeavours, a whole range of work and system there that women can make use of that don't involve crisis and struggle, you know. So, but sometimes crisis and struggle can move things ahead. So, for instance, in the world, you know, a lot of the changes to women's positions in parliaments, and so, you know, have been brought about because a new constitution's been written post-conflict. We saw that in Afghanistan. Originally, once the Taliban were ousted, there was a different constitution. Women made up 30% of parliament in a place that had been extremely male dominated. You know, so they can be forces of change, but you're right. No one wants to go through that sort of thing because the costs are enormous and terrible. So, but I don't, and I'm certainly not advocating that either. It's more just an observation of these social things can change our ways of life in all sorts of ways. But in India, you have the building blocks, and more than that, I think, compared to many other countries in the world, including my own. India is ahead in so many ways. So I think it's a good basis for women to be moving forward post-pandemic. And there is this focus on, you know, women-led development. That's something that women can use to try and get a foot into their next endeavours.
No, absolutely. Spot on. We've got a comment from Farha on chat, which I'm just going to read it out. It says, she's been listening into our conversation, and she says, unfortunately, the toughest part is when women themselves internalize misogyny and accept their positions as what others define rather than strive on the journey of self-actualization.
Mm.
And you know, I read this even between what both of us were talking about right now, about this larger bit about this the larger change and so on and so forth, and the kind of activities that can happen to give access and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think she's got this spot on as well, that a many number of times this internalization that ends up happening of misogyny, rather than self-actualization, is where the real cause also lies, right? And of course, society doesn't help combat that, and it doesn't make it easier for women at all. But do you have any thoughts around this, about this whole internalization of misogyny, and not really going on that journey of self-actualization, not being able to, not in many cases, not being allowed to, not being able to, not even, and I'd actually go to the extent of saying not even knowing that it's an option, right? And that's really what society's done, unfortunately. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a very sad aspect of discrimination, isn't it? And I mean, I think you're right. I think that people, men and women, internalize the sort of cultural norms around gender. You know, it's part of happens from the moment we're born, I think. So, and I think often you don't see those things until, in some ways, until you're almost out of your own cultural context, where you sort of run up against different cultures and think, oh, that's, what is that? You know, because, and you start to then reflect on your own culture, thinking, oh, okay, we do that differently. That's not a norm and a given. That's not a biological thing that we inherit, you know? So I think that's difficult, and I think that this is where education is so important, and where the social norms can change if children are brought up to to question and see things through different lenses. And then I think we all have to do the work in our own lives to recognise what is discrimination, and what are these norms that we've internalized, and is there another way that we can live our lives. And I think that's part of our life's journey. you know it's part of, I mean, it's I'm still doing that. And I think it's partly, I mean, this sounds sort of trite, but it is partly what makes us human, is to be able to understand and mirror, look into ourselves and see where those barriers are and what we can do to shift them in ourselves. And, I think there's a lot to be done on a personal level around these things, including things like meditation, which is something that I do every morning, trying to reflect on my life and myself. And yeah, so there's no shortcut, but it's an exciting process, that uncovering of a different way of seeing the world and being in the world.
No, I think again, a couple of things I want to pick up on, because one of them is also actually related to a question we've got on chat. But you're right, like there are no shortcuts, and I think that's the one thing that everyone who's working in this space needs to just recognize and understand, that we all will do what we can. But at the end of the day, we need to continue to keep doing with consistency, because there is sometimes, that's so often it happens that you do something, you thought that it had an impact, and then you suddenly realize after 6 months that it didn't have the kind of impact that you wanted. But then there was still that, maybe that 0.1% impact, which is still better than having nothing, right? And then you need to keep building on it and keep moving forward to actually make change happen. But one thing that you spoke of was education and educating our children, right? And that's a question that we actually have, and I'm going to paraphrase that right now from Kritika. And I'll drop in a personal experience that we've had as well in this space, where what she's really asking is that we don't necessarily have relevant conversations with our kids, because we think that they're too young to understand. And the seriousness of gender inequality is grave, it's dark, right? So what she's wondering is, isn't that a reason why we don't take it seriously once we grow up? Because as children, we've not been shown how bad it actually is. And the personal place where perhaps we as at H1 are also a bit guilty of this is, on one side, so in Mizoram and Manipur, we run baby leagues for soccer. So there are about 8-month-old leagues. We're running mixed gender leagues over there, which has been wonderful. We've got a lot of participation of the girl child along with the boys, and it's, I think, not just participation. I think the girls are doing better than the boys on many of the occasions, because this is a league between 5 to 12. The physical differences aren't as much, and so on and so forth. And the girls, like invariably every year in the top 3 scorers, we always have a girl. We've always got a girl being one of the best goalkeepers, and so on and so forth. And it's wonderful, right? And it's one of those happy things, like a happy way of trying to create gender equality, getting the brothers to say, hey, listen, sister, I need girls in my team. You need to come. It's a mixed gender league. Getting them also to get excited about it, and wanting each of them to like do well together, and so on and so forth. But now that's the sad part, perhaps, where again, on Kritika's question, we also, even though we've got this access to this homogeneous group now suddenly, where they're all seeing themselves as equal, they're not seeing themselves as girls and boys, because they're all seeing themselves as teammates. But we too shy away from having the tough conversations about what are the actual concerns surrounding gender equality, because we believe that just our action should be enough, hopefully, or at least play a part in trying to create that sort of equality as they grow up. But we're still not showing them the dark side, right? Now, is that something that you think is actually hampering our ability to try and create a gender equal world, when we can't talk to our children, or we don't talk to our children about the dark side of gender inequality?
Yeah, well, again, I think complicated question. And I think you hit on some really important things in framing that question, which was around the fact that there are many ways of demonstrating gender equality that are positive, happy, empowering. And so I think with anyone, children and others, we actually even spoke about this in the previous question as well, about, does it have to all be bad? Does it have to all be about crisis and struggle for power and things like that? And I think it doesn't, and it shouldn't. And I think with children in particular, it's so important to give them a feeling of hope and empowerment, that they can live different lives. And so I think through demonstrating positive role models through how we live in our own relationships, I think that's so important. And actually, there was some research done a few years ago that I think it was Australian research that looked at the impact of working mothers, because globally a lot of women feel very guilty that if they're working and they're not spending all their time with their children. And actually the study showed that actually children of working mothers are much more likely to have better paying and better jobs as they get older. And that's purely because they've seen their mother working in an empowered way in a good job. So that's another way of showing children, because children learn by seeing their parents first off and their families. So it's so important to role model this ourselves. And use of sport, there are so many empowered women in all different sectors of society that we can draw on for our children, including movie stars and singers, a whole range of different ways we can demonstrate women's leadership and their ability. But one of the ways on the darker side, one of the ways that I've been talking to my children about, my two youngest girls are 13 and 14, and they've been following on social media the whole thing of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, and her allegations, or his saying that she besmirched him by saying that he had attacked her. And they've been fully on Johnny Depp's side because they love him. And so I've been talking to them about that and challenging them about that and bringing in different ideas about, I mean, I don't know whether it's true or not. That's irrelevant to me, but it's the vehicle I can use to talk to them a bit more about the social constructs for men and women and the kinds of things that often happen, and the media and how the media can be used in different ways. And so I found that current event a way of discussing in a lively and fun way about these sort of deeper, more darker issues that your questioner raised. So there are ways of doing it, I think, but I think it is really important to demonstrate equality for children. I think that's so important, and probably more important than in-depth discussions that it has to be framed at their level of understanding.
So, what I get from that, Susan, again, of course, it's important to educate our children, but parallelly, it becomes extremely important also to educate our parents as to how they can deal with this, how they can bring these sort of
Yeah.
conversations about. Because unfortunately, we don't really have that much training for our parents, right? Now, again, even outside of gender equality, I think no one teaches a parent how to raise their child, right? There's no handbook or guidebook for that.
It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
Exactly. And so I just bring you back to our conversation that we are having right now. I think one of the things that a lot of people almost always end up asking me are questions around what strategy should one adopt towards solving for social concerns and problems and issues and so on and so forth. And even when it comes to gender equality, it just came to my head that we were talking about educating children. Then you spoke about how it's important for the parents also to be able to bring these conversations up, which means they need to be educated, they need to be told how it needs to be done. And I think when people ask that, okay, which is the preferred option, right? And people do that all the time. Very surprisingly, Susan, they say, what is better? Like, should we be going and speaking with the children? Should we be going and speaking with the parents? Should we be dealing with this at the local level, at the central level, and so on and so forth? Those kind of conversations keep happening. And I keep wondering to myself, the answer is all of them. Why
Yes.
are you getting me to choose, right? The moment you get me to choose, we're destined for, if not failure, but definitely going much slower than we can, right? We're so many of us, right? You can go and speak to the children. I can go speak to the parents, right? Someone else can go speak to the teachers. Someone else can go speak to someone else. And why are we not talking about all of it together? Why do we want to prioritize saying that this is more important or this is how we're going to do this? It's all of them, right? And do you face that as well? Like, do you face this prioritization challenge where people ask you to prioritize when it's, again, I'm laughing about it, but it actually sometimes frustrates me that, oh, why are we asking for these priorities when we have, and we potentially can solve for all, and potentially we can look at everything. Maybe from a standpoint of timeline, you may prioritize, but not really with respect to objective, right?
Yeah. Yep. No, I'm with you on that. Completely agree. And actually, in my experience over the years, I've been a gender advisor in different contexts, and people always want, I mean, I don't like this metaphor, but it's kind of perfect for this, a silver bullet. You know, they always want something that will just hit the target and it'll all be solved. And it's just not like that. You know, we're humans, we're messy, we're complicated, we're enormously diverse, and we live in incredibly different contexts. So it is, um, it has to involve a range of different things, and not, it's not a very technical term, but you know, and actually there's a fantastic prevention program that's been found to be successful in changing social norms around gender-based violence, called SASA, and it was developed in Uganda, and it's now been sort of contextualized in different countries in the world. And there was this very painstaking evaluation of, did it work? And it found this, impact evaluation actually found that in certain cities in where it had been tried, the idea, the internalized norms around, is it okay to beat your wife, and both held by men and women, changed radically, like halved in the space of 3 years. So showing that these really entrenched norms can change, and that program specifically does what you said. It combines a whole range of dialogue, basically. So ordinary people having conversations with people on the bus or in markets or at schools or wherever about these issues, and bringing them to life in people's minds in a way that they understand and can question. And it specifically calls on, you know, use of media, training of teachers so they can deal with it in classrooms, training of, you know, faith-based leaders so that they can bring it into their conversations with their constituencies, you know, working with politicians, all sorts of levels. And it's based on dialogue. So, yeah, I completely agree. There is not one particular thing. That said, though, there are some things like good education that raises these issues with children that it really are the foundation for some of these changes, I think. And that you know, can be done at scale because it's usually offered by the government in across countries. So there are certain things that are sort of low-hanging fruit within that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And as I think Ashish, who's put a question on chat, which I think this broadly answers what he was saying as well, where he's saying that when we're looking at create, and I'm paraphrasing because it's quite a long comment, but when we're looking at implementing policies around gender, that's what we really end up prioritizing. Whereas in reality, there's a lot of intersectionality that goes into the implementation of this, because again, and just from something that we keep talking about is that first, if you look at a woman being discriminated, right, and you try and solve for that, you'll realize that it's now no longer a woman, it's a Dalit woman being discriminated. And then you need to solve for that caste as well. Then you realize that it's a Dalit woman from Jharkhand that's being discriminated against, and you need to solve for that regional discrimination as well, right? And then you get to find out that it's a Dalit woman from Jharkhand who's from an economically weaker section of society, and then that's what you need to solve for as well, right? And I think that intersectionality just becomes crucial. And in terms of what we were saying as well, you have to speak of all of these various things to actually create the kind of change that hopefully changes that we hope that would improve things and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
But I think both of us would agree with Ashish that the intersectionality just is crucial for any time we're looking at policy changes or interventions at the social level.
Yes. Absolutely. Completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Absolutely. All right. So moving on, we've got a question from Farha. So Farha says that how do you perceive providing monetary value to unpaid work? Do you think this is going to change perspectives, or will it deteriorate the existing condition, especially in a country like India? Because again, and if I need to add to that question, there has been conversations about providing monetary value to unpaid work in different ways. But the moment that I'm fearing this, that the moment that you find Indian men, and I'm talking about India in particular, or really South Asia, realizing that there's money to be made from this, there'll be very different forms of discrimination that'll take place, and very different forms of subjugation that'll take place, because then now suddenly there's value to the woman who's actually staying at home, because there's money that that woman gets from either the government or as part of subsidies and so on and so forth, right? Now, I don't know. Now, if it could be a great thing, right? But will it actually lead to empowerment of women or more subjugation? Because now there's a value attached to them being at home. I'm not really sure, and I don't have an answer for this. I don't have a thought one way or the other. But if you do, that would be good to hear what you've got to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that either, and I don't know what it would look like suddenly paying women for work, or paying not just women but men also who are doing the domestic work if women aren't, or if they're sharing it. So I don't know how that would look. I think one way of looking at that is the work that's been done by different economists around the world, including in India, looking at the like costing the work that women do as unpaid labour as part of the macroeconomic understanding. And I think that kind of work can be very useful for governments in developing policies and legislation that help women be protected, and that value the work that they do, even if it is domestic work. I mean, basically, if women weren't there looking after children and elderly and getting the household in order, arguably men wouldn't be able to go to work. They'd be needing to do that. So there is a cost and a value, a monetary value to this economically in the largest possible term. So I think doing that is a good step forward to try and understand what is the contribution to the macroeconomic environment. And I think that can help governments think through policies that ensure that women get what they need to live decent lives, whether they are at home or at work. Um, yeah. Um, but I think on the other hand, like, just, yeah, I just don't know how governments would pay for that, apart from in social protection measures like pensions and benefits and things. And I think there always is a risk that as women start to earn income, that that I mean, again, UN Women at different places has done some research about this in different countries. Not as far as I know in India, but where I was based in the Pacific, we looked at this issue about when women earn income, does it release them from some of the constricting social norms, so that they're able to be more empowered, or can it, for example, trigger more violence as men struggle to control that income that women are bringing in? And we found, even in the most macho kind of cultures, we found it was a very mixed picture. There was a whole spectrum, and there was not one or the other. So about a third of women, it enabled them to be more empowered and have more control over their income and their lives and their choices. About a third of women, it triggered more domestic violence, as men sought to control women more because they felt threatened by this new level of empowerment. And about a third of people, it made no difference to their empowerment one way or the other. They may have already felt empowered before they got the job, you know? So I think it's always going to be a mixed picture, that issue. And I guess the last point on that is that in more female dominated environments, again, I know this from Australia, for instance, childcare, that it seems to be a very common thing. Also, nursing, that the higher up you go, so the more jobs that earn more income, even though it's a very female-dominated profession, those jobs seem to be held more by men. And again, that mirrors the cultural norm about men as leaders. And that's something that can be handled by policy and by commitment from the institutions in selections, making sure that women, it's a fair selection process. And also such things as targets within companies or whatever, so that women, there's 50% women in leadership, for example. And those targets have made a difference for women in that, in dealing with this issue of men taking over those more lucrative and powerful places.
No, absolutely. And I think, for me, I think right through that answer, what I was thinking, because there will always be the pros and cons. There will always be the positive and a bit of the negative that will come from any decision that one may end up taking. And at the end of the day, I think perhaps one way of looking at it is that if there's a particular action that can have a positive impact, run with it, and at the same time, don't forget to deal with the negative impact, right? So allow for the positive to happen, while at the same time keeping an eye out for the negative and then dealing with it as it comes along, right? But not for the fear of the negative should not be why we shy away from creating positive
Yes,
change. And I think
totally
that.
agree. Actually, Ramit, just on that, I'm so glad you said that, because often in the development world, I've noticed that, if there is a backlash, often development practitioners say, oh, in the interests of do no harm, we therefore can't open that opportunity to women. And that's fundamentally the wrong thing to do, I think, because it again limits women's choice over their own lives. They may know that there's this risk, they will know there's a risk, but they still want to do it. So our job is mitigating the risk, not stopping the choice. And a great example of that was when I was in Papua New Guinea. There was a road program that the Australian Aid program was funding, and they had a target in there of meeting the needs of 30% women being workers on the roads and being paid in cash. And women came out in droves to get those jobs. And the contractor who was doing the work discovered that there was a backlash against these women from domestic violence from their husbands, or their husbands took the cash when the women went home. So it was another form of like indentured labour in a way. And so I was so impressed, because instead of just saying, we can't do that, they instead sent community development people into the villages and sat down with women and men, male leaders, these tribal areas, and women to sort of discuss, look, if you allow your women to be involved in this, everyone benefits. And actually they incentivized reaching that 30% target by saying, if the village has 30% women who are able to keep and control their income, we shall give you like a payment to or paint the school, or build a well, or some sort of community thing that everyone obviously benefited from. And that was enough to unlock that whole system for women and make it safe for them to participate. So there are always ways around these issues.
And that's the thing, right, Susan? There are always ways. We just need to keep our mind open, keep thinking about these ways, and you'll always find a solution. And if you can
Yes.
find solutions to so many complicated, other complicated things, like this is, it's unfortunate, right? And it's this dichotomy where people say the gender equality is so complicated because of so many nuances, and at the same time, I would still probably want to contend that it's so easy because it's really about the people, right? It's all really about the conversations, and that's what we do anyway, right? So it's this dichotomy always fascinates me about it being so difficult yet so easy at the same time, right?
Yeah, I agree.
True. So I know we're already on the hour mark, but if we have another few minutes, we've got a couple more questions that I'd want to take up from the comments. Um, one is Varun asks that, well, he actually makes a point saying that sometimes leaders have used religious material to defy orthodox gender norms, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy back here in India. Do we think that as a temporary quick measure, leaders should take this route for change? And this probably actually comes from the place of saying that there may be other concerns or issues for taking this route. But at the end of the day, because religion is so important in our country in India, and then if we can show through our religious texts that, yes, even our religious texts, which they do talk about gender equality and a gender equal world, and we try and showcase that more than, say, some of the other parts which don't speak of equality. Can we, and is that probably a route to take, or should we be talking about society, or do we actually use these tools also to try and create a gender equal world, like the tools of religion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be interested to hear from all of you around the potential within Hindu religion, because I'm not familiar with the sort of the potential there for discussion. But I know from within the Christian religion, for example, that's been extremely useful for many women, is working with leaders within the faith who have a definition of gender equality that's empowering of women. And because within that religion, and I'm assuming within any religion, there are diversities there as well, and so there are always people who are interested in framing gender equality from within the religious texts. And so that has been a very powerful way for many women who want to live, empowered lives, but have been unable to live. They've been faced with a choice sometimes of, well, if women are defined as lesser than men within my religion, where does that leave me? Do I have to forsake these ideas that are so important to me, or what? So it allows women a choice of remaining within their faiths, and it also challenges some of the dominant norms that have been very destructive to women over the millennium. So I know that to be true, and there's many texts within the Christian religion that different faith leaders have used to understand this for themselves and to continue their own journey of conscientization, So I'm assuming that would be true for Hindu faith as well.
No, it is absolutely. And Simran has got us follow up on that as well. And then Varun, to both of you, what I'd also tell you to do is go watch a dialogue we had with Zainah Anwar last year. Zainah Anwar is the founder of Musawah, and what she's doing in Southeast Asia is primarily trying to reclaim Islam for women, right? Where she's actually pointing out parts of Islam which have been misinterpreted and so on and so forth, and actually finding ways from within religion, while allowing everyone, and exactly how Susan said, to allow them to and allow is probably the wrong word, but to have them continue to follow the belief system that they've grown up with, the belief system that they value, but within that belief system also to reclaim the parts that allow for gender equality, that provide for it, that at least in the way Zainah put it, is integral to their belief system and not the converse, right? So I'd say Simran, Varun, and everyone else on this call, do take a look at that conversation we had with Zainah, because that's something that she's actively doing right now.
And actually, in Australia, I worked with migrant and refugee communities for a number of years, and I worked very closely with the Islamic Women's Federation there, and they were Islamic women from all over the Islamic world. Sorry about the background noise.
No worries.
And they were amazing. They were able to work within their own communities along these lines, and as your questioner said, really reclaiming that faith for themselves as well, and they remained part of their Islamic communities, and they were able to live and did live very very empowered and amazing lives, actually. Yeah.
True. No, thank you so much for this, Susan. Before we let you go, there's one customary question that we ask of everyone at the FAIR Dialogue, whoever comes for the FAIR Dialogues, is what is your understanding of fairness and what do you believe is what being fair actually means? Whether to you personally or a message that you have for everyone who's listening, both would actually be wonderful.
Okay, fairness. Well, in Australia, we have a saying that, everyone deserves a fair go, meaning I think it's important for everyone to be able to um, live their lives in a way that they want to. And that means that that's often not given to us on a plate, is it? It means that there needs to be, societal change to enable people to have equal access to information and services and, financial flows and that sort of thing, as well as equal and fairness within the household. So I think that I often think of, governance is often seen as a sort of a state thing, but actually I think families have governance as well, and there needs to be fairness within decision making and access to rights and resources from the household level upwards. So that's what I see as fairness.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this and for your time. I know that you've taken time out from your leave to be with us here right now. So, genuinely, thank you very much for that. To everyone who's been listening in right now, who'll be listening in going forward in the future, thank you for doing this, for listening in. And as I'd mentioned right in the beginning, it's the real value and purpose of this conversation with all of what Susan said is to get your thoughts to go, right? And for getting your thoughts to develop in a manner where you can make these thoughts your own, whatever those thoughts may be, right? So I hope we've given you enough to do that for the here and the now. We'll be back next week with another FAIR Dialogue, details of which will be out soon. And for the here and the now, thank you so much for your time. And wherever you're watching from, have a wonderful rest of the day for yourselves. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.